While Europeans were first introduced to the notion of paper money in Marco Polo's travels in the late 1200, as a technology, it didn't really catch on for another at least 300 years. The first real extensive use we see of paper money in Europe, which is where we pick up our story next, was in Amsterdam. The Empire of the Netherlands was a major trading nation at the time and was frequently visited by merchants coming from other countries who had their own trade currencies with them in order to exchange for different kinds of goods. Now, of course, this created all kinds of problems. Even though many of these currencies were made of precious metals, this required standardizing their weights and assaying all of them. And they simply could not be accepted at face value, which of course complicates exchange and payments, meaning that every merchant who wants to accept foreign coins needs to not only assay and weigh them, but that also needs to be concerned with the actual act of resmelting foreign coins into local coins that can be used. So in response to this expansion of massive number of currencies that were circulating in Amsterdam, the city created an institution called the Whistlebank in 1609, which would exchange all foreign and local currencies for paper notes of deposit. Now, these paper notes of deposit could be used absolutely anywhere in the city and were deemed to actually be more reliable form of currency than the various kinds of metal that had been circulating at the time, because it had a guaranteed value among all of the different merchants without the necessary costs of assaying. And simply put, given the deposits of various coins which had been made, the Whistlebank was then willing to cash people out into the various forms of currencies they desired when they left. Now, of course, there were fees for storage and exchange of currencies, but it's worth noting that this new kind of paper money, even though it was a local currency only useful within the city, was so popular that it commanded a premium above the value of the underlying coinage that it represented. And this stayed in place for almost 2 centuries until the bank finally collapsed in 1791. Now, of course, following from the model of the Whistlebank, other institutions later created a very similar kind of paper money backed by metallic currencies, usually precious metals for the most part, as opposed to simple copper currencies. And this made it much easier for people to be able to transact rather than having to carry around vast amounts of metal to and from. They found the same advantages that the Sung had enjoyed, made commerce in early modern Europe much, much more practical. And so, unfortunately for gold bugs, the use of precious metals seemed to decline or to disappear into the background, because even though it may have underlied some of the paper currencies which later circulated, like the United Kingdom's pound, which was gold backed from 1844 up until the early 20th century, with just a couple of interruptions, we still found that governments making payments to one another would not accept payment in the paper currencies issued by their counterparties. Instead, governments tended to demand being paid in gold. And that meant that we still needed a kind of universal currency that would allow us to move money between these various local payment systems. And gold was among the most popular. So when England decided to issue a broad paper currency that would cover most of its imperial territories, starting in 1844, the Bank of England notes were backed exclusively by fixed quantities of gold. And this proved to be problematic. While it did generate significant price stability over the following 60 to 70 years, it did create regular financial crises throughout the empire as the quantity of available gold kept bumping up against its limits. There was a greater desire for transactions than necessarily was available in terms of physical gold, or even the paper that represented physical. And so inevitably, as the government found itself under extraordinary pressures when it came to things like World War I and World War II, we eventually see the abandonment of this form of gold-backed currencies. But they didn't disappear entirely. We'll discuss very quickly the dominance of the US dollar in this regard. Since the end of World War II, the US was in a position of absolutely dominating the globe in terms of international trade and finance. At the time, the US Navy was more than twice the size of every other navy in the world combined. 1/3 of global GDP took place in the United States, and 1/2 of the entire consumer market of planet Earth was in the United States, despite the fact that at the time, they only had 6% of the global population. Now, coupling these things together was the fact that the United States at the end of the war found itself facing off against a very important rival, the Soviet Union. And it very quickly got about to building a security economic alliance that they could use to try to contain the Soviet Union. In fact, most of the victors of World War II met in 1944 at an American conference at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to establish what the effectively New World financial order would look like in the absence of large imperial states. And one of the things that was done was establishing the centrality of the US dollar to this new currency regime. The US dollar, like the pound before it, was backed by a fixed quantity of gold, and all other currencies were to maintain an exchange rate into US dollars. And as such, the US dollar became the central currency in international finance. Um, Now, of course, one of the ways to ensure that you have a reserve currency like this is not to default on your debts. That level of trust and security that you won't default on an obligation is essential to people's belief that the US dollar should hold its value over time. In fact, throughout its history, the United States has not defaulted on its debts, and this is one of the reasons that countries and investors around the world hold it in such high regard as an asset. It's interesting to note that French Finance Minister Valéry Destaing famously remarked that this centrality of the US dollar in international payments afforded the US government what he called an exorbitant privilege that bestowed extraordinary political power on the United States because foreigners constantly found themselves effectively supporting American standards of living and subsidizing American multinationals. The way this worked is that in order for them to transact in most international trade, these countries needed dollars. And the United States, as the issuer of dollars, had particular privilege of being able to enjoy what we call seigniorage, a topic we'll discuss more when we look at monetary policy and central banks. But suffice to say, it should be obvious to everyone that a 20-pound note or a $20 bill doesn't cost 20 pounds or $20 to create. And therefore, the United States, as the supplier of this fiat currency, finds itself in a position of accepting full value for the currency that it issues, full face value, while only actually incurring the costs of production. So, despite the diversification of American economic power since the 1940s and 50s, it's worth noting that today the US dollar still remains the reference asset for pricing most internationally traded goods, from currencies to commodities, with currently over 1/3 of global invoicing involves a US dollar transaction, which doesn't actually even involve an American entity. So people have adopted using the US dollar to trade amongst themselves, knowing that this will still be valuable for when they do have to interface with commodity markets or the American market itself. But paper money has a pretty long tradition, in fact. And I think it's worth talking briefly about some of the historical aspects of paper money in Canada in particular. What you'll see up here at the top of the screen is what we call card money. Card money was issued in the 1700s by the pre-conquest French government because there was a lack of circulating metal coins among the French colonies in Nouvelle-France. Various notes, very similar to what was happening in Sung China, were issued by the government as promissory notes that these would be honored in the future. Unlike the Chinese promissory notes, though, they were not backed by any sort of physical commodities, unfortunately. Now, by the time Canada reaches the 1800s, and we see that it has largely been absorbed into the British Empire, both politically and economically. What we find at that time, though, is that there is still a desperate shortage of metal coinage in Canada. The metal coins that are circulating tend to be Spanish doubloons, French crowns, or American metal dollars. So unsurprisingly, given the shortage of currencies that were available, let alone currencies controlled by local authorities, paper became the answer. So even though by the 1850s, most of the circulating currency is what we call bank money or depository receipts from banks, we don't begin to really see the creation of government-backed paper money until almost a full century later. The Governor General at the time, mid-19th century in Canada, Lord Sydenham, had proposed creating a government bank of issue back in 1841. It was supposed to be backed by a combination of gold and government debt as the underlying assets. But the bankers at the time were a much stronger lobby group, and Sydenham's notion to create a government bank of issue back in the 1840s was defeated by commercial banks. Another attempt was tried in the 1870s to move to a currency that was backed by government debt, but unfortunately that failed as well. By 1935, however, a particular change happens in Canada, and the paper currencies issued by banks that were so popular in the 1800s were systematically supplanted by notes issued by the newly formed Bank of Canada starting in 1935. So you can see that paper has a relatively long history as a currency, but it's had to go through a lot of evolutionary bumps and starts, beginning back as far as Tang China when there were shortages of copper, and moving all the way forward to a modern world where we see the United States government printing up vast amounts of currency in order to be able to manage the debts that they'll be incurring as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Have we seen the end of paper money? Not yet, but it's worth considering what might replace it as we move into the 21st century. And that's what we'll be exploring next.